Hi. Is my mic working? Testing. Okay. So I'm back with chapter 3 of The Dry Wood. This is kind of a cold read. I haven't read this book in a long time, but this is my way of practicing with cold reads, and I hope that there's somebody out there that would enjoy reading this awesome novel called The Dry Wood by Caryll Houselander. So in chapters 1 and 2, we were introduced to Father Malone's funeral, and his parish is trying to get him canonized right away. And then in the next chapter, you see the effect that Father Malone's death has on the clergy. So Monsignor Frayne and the Archbishop are discussing what to do with this movement that is being built around the death of Father Malone. So without further ado, Chapter 3, The Multitude. But now Jesus called his disciples and said, I am moved with pity for the multitude. Matthew 15, verse 32. Upstairs in Archbishop's house, silence returned to the room, falling flake by flake on the Archbishop's soul, as snow falls flake by flake on the world. Silence settled and became peace, as snow becomes stillness when a sky is emptied. Archbishop Creasy crossed to the window and looked down. The people were passing in an endless gray procession below. The shops and offices had poured out their hosts of workers. They moved in great blocks and automatically, as if they were obeying orders from some invisible controller, and yet they seemed isolated from one another. Every face in the multitude of faces was a separate, blank loneliness. In the office, they must have worked, talked, and giggled together. They must have shared syrupy black tea and known a kind of communion in its warm sickliness. They must have been bound together by the loyalties and affections, by the pettiness and even the quarrels in the office. In the littleness of the office world, they must have ceased to be insignificant, even sometimes have become part of something small enough for smallness to taste omnipotence. They must have found an escape in the pygmy world of the office from even a hint of awareness of the immensity of which they were really a part and which they could not face. Now they disintegrated, as if when the clock struck 6, it struck off the chains that bound them together, with 6 sharp little blows, and they fell apart, each one falling away from the pygmy unity that they had achieved, back into the vastness of the universe, in which each was an individual and alone. They appeared intent on getting somewhere quickly, yet there was no eagerness in their faces, only a certain tenseness, as if they were driven and could not stop hurrying if they would. The very idea of one of them sauntering home slowly, enjoying the twilight, his hands pushed into his pockets, whistling as he strolled along, was unthinkable. Where? Archbishop Creasy asked himself. Where are they all going to? To the cheap boarding houses of Hampstead, Belsize Park, Bayswater and Maida Vale, tawdry and drab, with the stucco flaking off from the damp walls, like heavy makeup flaking off from the rattled faces of old women who weep. To the lodging houses beyond Vauxhall and Pimlico, with texts that have hung unread upon their walls for 50 years, to be mocked by the dreary sins of the drifting population of lodgers, and with washstands of varnished yellow wood and awful china jugs and basins that have mocked the dreams of generations of young men. To the students' hostels, where the least adventurous young men and women live in cubicles as wide as coffins, and feed in common dining rooms on a diet of cold mutton, beetroot, stewed pears, and tepid water. To the tawdry hotels round Bloomsbury, where the dark rooms smell of dust, cheap scent, and mice. To the attics of small hotels in Notting Hill and Kensington, where for a good address and hotel note paper oh, where for a good address and hotel note paper, poor, frustrated little snobs can sleep under the roof with no fire in the winter and vermin all the year round. And these slightly more preposterous, more respectable city men, where are they hurrying to, these pale, small men in bowler hats, with shy mustaches on their upper lips, and the beginning of little paunches, and a pathetic, sprouting pomposity in their bearing? Where are they going to? Out to the little eggshell houses in the suburbs, the houses designed and built for one child and childless marriages, more terrible than those in London that are visibly rotting and falling into decay, more terrible because of their very neatness and whiteness and sweetness, because of the roses in the prim gardens that the master of the house shows off so proudly on Sundays to the privileged junior clerks invited for the day, more terrible because of the neat rows of cultivated flowers standing against the new white walls that are the pretty sepulchres of the murdered unborn children. Wow. More tragic than all the rest, because here, having attained to that which they put their faith in, having attained it at the cost of all the adventure, all the risk, all the romance, all the poetry in life, and by years of monotony, years of boredom, years of drudgery, they are afraid of life still, afraid even in security, even in the cage. The goal is achieved, the regular salary, the assured pension, the life insurance, the detached residence, the garden, the wireless, the car, the wife with the permanent wave, the heavy lunch on Sundays, and the after lunch discomfort and somnolence that is the symbol of success. All that achieved, and in that achievement, all the natural capacities of the little man developed and stretched to their limit, and yet he confesses in his heart and by his deeds that this life that has cost him everything and is the sum of his happiness is not worth having. For he refuses it to his children and murders them in the moment of conception. Like his divine master, the archbishop was moved with pity for the multitude. What a description of multitude that was. Wow. It seemed small wonder to him that those who had faith wanted a saint of their own, one who was one of themselves, who was close to them, living their life in their day. Not one of the great, but one of the least. Not one of the elite, but one of the multitude. One who knew the same nagging cares, the same haunting fears, the same incessant temptations as they did, and yet believed in the fatherhood of God. One who was subjected to the same exploitation and greed as they were, to the same disillusionment and betrayal, and yet who believed in the communion of men. One whose clothes smelt as theirs smelt, and were worn to the same grotesque shapes that theirs were worn to, the sad, sagging shapes of original sin, and who yet believed that this life is a putting on of Christ, like a garment. One who shared the dullness of their thoughts, the weariness of their minds, the feebleness of their loves, and yet believed that the Holy Spirit is at home in man's soul. One who shared their need for the comfort of sensuality, the drag downwards into the warm darkness at the root of their being, and who yet kissed in the dust of the common street the print of the feet that shone like snow upon Tabor. One who shared the one who shared the wearing monotony of their poverty, and yet would crack the walls of materialism that they had built around themselves and let in the light of glory. "This is what they need," said the Archbishop, and he spoke aloud to the darkening room. "A saint. I would like to give the people a saint." He saw a newspaper boy hurrying down the curb, the people snatching his papers as they passed, and he remembered yet again that war threatened England, that all the squalor and mediocrity might at any moment be uprooted, and that the drifting multitude might hear the echo of that mysterious warning in their own lives. "Thou fool, this night do they require thy soul of thee." He thought of Poland, of Czechoslovakia, of Russia, of the martyrs who had already answered the demand for their country's soul. How would England answer? Whom would she yield up if her soul were challenged, were demanded of her this very night? Would it be found that among her multitudes there were a few who would come, not driven, not compelled, but with the will of Jesus Christ to be sacrificed, to be given for the people? Or might it be that even now there were some who were immolated in secret, given already for the multitude? If so, would they save the people? Would Willie Jewell? The Archbishop suddenly caught his breath. What was this absurdity that he was thinking? But was it absurd? Might not a suffering child be the greatest power in the world, the only force stronger than the power of evil? Crucified innocence. Could God withstand that? And could God allow that for any reason less than the redemption of the world? He wondered what kind of child Willie was, whether he had made his first communion, how he expressed himself, being dumb, how he had made the love of the whole of Riverside his own. And he thought, the life of a little child like that, silent and helpless, is like the life of the host. He turned and looked at the cathedral, the shrine of the silent host, and for him the symbol of the church. He, like Monsignor Frayne, thought of the church as his mother, and as the mother of the whole world. But for him there was no cause of anxiety in her illimitable variety. She was both peasant and queen, a queen crowned with stars, who wore her jeweled cope over her peasant's frock and her wide apron, a mother who must wash her children with her own hands in the shining waters of baptism and absolution, who must feed them at her table on the living bread and the water of life, who must close their eyes with her own firm, pitiful fingers for the little sleep between death and resurrection. It was part of her wisdom that the glory of the saints is secret, that we on earth see their tears, their struggle, their wounds, the old clothes they have left off, and their bones, that she cherishes their bones as a mother cherishes her children's milk teeth. When the children have grown to manhood, because they remind her that once they were little and weak and were fed at her breast. Part of her illimitable wisdom is that we must ask a miracle of every new saint, that to prove that they are at God's side, they must reach a hand through the cloud to alleviate our sorrow, the sign of their glory, a touch of love in the darkness. The people had all gone and the streets were empty. Twilight drained out of the sky, and the cathedral became a vast silhouette, dark against silver emptiness. The archbishop remained standing still by the window, his shoulders bowed as if he actually felt the weight of the world's sorrow heavy upon them. The ring on his finger glowed like a drop of blood. Above the tower, the beauty of the world gathered into a single star that shone over London like the star of Bethlehem. That's the end of chapter 3. Okay. Chapter 4. A door is open. Then a vision came to me. I saw a door in heaven standing open. Revelations 4, verse 1. Father Malone had been dead for nearly a year, but his presence in the parish did not diminish. It grew. It was almost tangible. Every day, joy increased, like a warm and lasting spring after a long winter. At first, sunlight pale as primrose, in whose constancy no one dared to trust, and then, miraculously, the world flowering in light day after day. His people had always known their Father Malone would never leave him. He would never really go away as if they had no need of him. He would never take a holiday from them, even though now, thank God, he was at rest. They knew this because he was proving it, showing it to them. He was answering their prayers. At every house on his round of parish visits, Father O'Grady was told of answered prayers. Father Malone had cured styes and eyes, headaches and bad colds. He had found rooms and jobs. He had averted operations, cured scruples. He had brought home lost kittens and sailors whose ships were overdue. He had eased rheumatics, made the sun to shine on the mother's outing, and grown flowers in window boxes. But all these things were nothing at all compared to the wonder of the simple awareness of his presence, the sense of heaven in the marrow of their bones, of miracle beating in their heart. The streets had a new and lyrical air. Scarlet geraniums flamed from green window boxes. Canaries were more yellow and sang more shrilly. Front door steps were whitened. The skies above the crooked chimney pots were bluer, with the soft liquid blue of a child's eyes smiling through tears. Washing hung across the houses like a flutter of pennons. Snatches of laughter and of singing came through the open doors and windows. Father O'Grady found himself quoting from the Apocalypse, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. All the same, he added, that's not quite applicable. There certainly will be sorrow and weeping and pain and death, for we haven't done with sin by a long way yet, or with its consequences. And as long as there is sin, there will be sorrow, and there will be the passion of our Lord Jesus Christ going on in men. But Father Malone had sent a blessing on his people's sorrows, as if he had poured a bucket of light over them. From house to house went Father O'Grady, listening to the same litany of troubles, the aches and pains of rheumatism, the damp seeping into the walls, the swarms of rats, the way the landlord wouldn't repair the roof, God have mercy on the black-hearted devil. The long wait at the labor exchange, the hardness of the means test, the children who had to be hidden when the inspectors came, the new flats with hot water laid on where you mayn't have children or dogs or cats so no one can live in them. There were the mothers who were always hard at it, who hadn't sat down all day, and the mothers who had been taken off suddenly to the hospital for an operation. There were the daughters who stayed out all hours, and the daughters who were not allowed to bring their young men home. There were the sons who couldn't get work, and the sons who wouldn't get up in the morning, and the sons who were morose and sulky at home, though as charming as you like everywhere else. There were the fathers who were on strike, the fathers who were worn out, the fathers who spent their money in the public house instead of bringing it home on Saturday night. There were ankles that swelled, hands that chapped, backs that ached, and so it went on and on and on, the same interminable litany of unholy poverty that had been poured into Father O'Grady's ears day after day, week after week for years. But now, though the same hardships prevailed, a change had come about. Everything shone in a new light, as if the sun had come out on a heap of rubble, and where before there had been only rusty tin cans, dry bones, and broken glass, now there was silver, ivory, and crystal, and, forcing its way up through the dust and the rubbish, triumphant in loveliness, a flowering weed lifted a pure and shadowless face to the sun. Everyone hoped, every workless boy knew, that there was a job for him just round the corner. Every boy and girl in love waited breathlessly for the miracle that would enable them to marry. Every old woman felt sure that her aches and pains were a little better today and would be a lot better tomorrow. Everyone expected a softening in the hearts of landlords and employers. Everyone's senses were awakened to wonder at the loveliness they looked at, listened to, touched, and breathed. People saw one another and heard one another's voices for the first time. Everyone was made new. Every mind quickened. Every heart broke into splendor like a spray of red blossom breaking from the wood of an old black thorn. In spite of so much joy, there was a flaw, one infection that seemed to spread from tongue to tongue: the scandal about Carmel Fernandez. Not that she was the only one who had brought shame to her people, far from it. There was young Lizzie Jones, for example, who was expecting a child and would not marry the father of it because she said that if she did, she would be like a cat with a rattling tin can tied unto its tail for the rest of her life. But Lizzie was plain and downcast, whilst Carmel was beautiful and proud. Lizzie wept noisily and confided her troubles to everyone, while Carmel was aloof and apart and would not have accepted sympathy. She moved like an Indian, delicately, like grass swaying lightly. Lizzie had been betrayed by a sailor in port, while Carmel had it in her power to betray Solly Lee. "Have you heard about Carmel Fernandez, father?" "I have heard idle talk, and I do not encourage it." "It is no idle talk. She is gone away as brazen as a brass gong with Solly Lee. She has broken her father's heart." "Maybe there wasn't enough love in her home." "Her father brought her up well in hopes she would be a nun, and she a child of Mary too." "We cannot know the extenuating circumstances." "The what?" "The things that provide excuses." "Excuses, indeed. There are no excuses. She is a proper little hussy." "Now, child, remember what our Lord said. The harlots and sinners. That's what she is, all right, a harlot and sinner. And so it went on, and it seemed to the priest who had baptized Carmel Fernandez and given her her first communion that she was like a wild bird lost in a storm who was thrown back into his heart as onto a rock for shelter. To sweeten the bitter gossip, he wove it through with prayer. Have you heard about Carmel? Carmel Fernandez? Have mercy on her, O Lord, according to your great mercy. She is a harlot and a sinner. She has broken her father's heart. If thou, O Lord, wilt observe iniquities, Lord, who shall endure it? Who shall endure it? She has pearls round her neck. Pearls are for tears. The kingdom of heaven is like unto a merchant seeking good pearls. She's lost to perdition, that's what she is. Who, when he had found one pearl of great price, she's a worthless hussy, that's what she is, went his way and sold all that he had and bought it. Pearls are for tears. She has pearls round her neck. She is painting the town red, so people say. Tears of Christ wash her. Tears of Christ wept over Lazarus. Lazarus. Lave her in the water of everlasting life. Tears of Christ shed for Jerusalem. Restore her to grace. Wash her in your tears, and she shall be white, whiter than snow. Though her sins are as red as scarlet, she shall be white, whiter than snow. Have you heard about Carmel Fernandez? She is dressed up like a film star straight out of Hollywood. By your seamless garment that the soldiers cast lots for, have mercy on her, on Carmel Fernandez. They say she smells of scent that's solely bought in Paris. By the right spikenard shed for your burial, have pity on Carmel Fernandez. There was one other subject of which everyone spoke even more willingly today than of the scandal of Carmel. The novena for Willie Jewell. This too embarrassed Father O'Grady, but for quite other reasons. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, closer to his heart than the cause of Father Malone. In fact, if the plain truth must be told, he had almost anticipated the judgment of the Holy Church and already beatified his old friend in his own mind. He experienced not a little uneasiness of conscience, because he secretly gave the reverence due a relic to Father Malone's stinking old black pipe. And he had put his disgraceful mossy hat and his boots with the turned-up toes and holes in the soles away in a locked cupboard for the veneration of posterity. But it so happened that he had a letter in his pocket from the Archbishop's secretary warning him, though in the most courteous terms imaginable, to go easy with his saint, to observe every possible caution, constantly reminding himself that prudence is the queen of virtues, to allow nothing which could possibly be interpreted as public prayer, to watch for the least symptom of hysteria, and in general, to remember that the longer a saint is allowed to settle in the grave, the less troublesome he is likely to be. He was also advised that owing to somewhat disquieting reports that had reached the ears of His Grace, it would be wise to approach Mr. Solomon Lee tactfully on the subject of halos. Father O'Grady had already considered tackling Solly on this subject, partly because of the increasing annoyance of his mass production of NIMBY, and partly because his lamb that was lost, Carmel Fernandez, was lost in Solly's lush and heady pastures, to which, therefore, he wanted, in his rôle of shepherd, to find a way in. Every mantelpiece exhibited one of Solly's holy cards, and each was less like the original than the last. That in Magdalena's That in Magdalena Hogg's living room was, or at least he hoped it was, as far as even Solly could go. In this one, although the hair, which curled repulsively on the shoulders, was white, the face was smooth and girlish, a uniformly salmon pink, like the face of a pale city clerk in the first phase of seaside sunburn on a bank holiday. The hands, which were the heart-shaped, tapering hands of an old lady of the Victorian convention, clasped a sheaf of wax-like lilies. The background was a foaming heap of white meringue framed by sugar-pink garlands of roses, and most offensive of all to Father O'Grady's troubled eyes was the enormous halo, which had now developed from a tentative hair-like ring to a solid plate of glory, shaded from deep orange vermilion to saffron, and resembling an illuminated poached egg. Great description of a saccharine holy card. He felt that with the letter from Southminster metaphorically biting him in his pocket, he ought to start protesting. But Magdala drowned his first hesitating words in a flood of hospitality. "Now, father, a cup of tea. I know you're dying for it. The Irishman never lived that was not, and Hogg always says to me, Mag, he said, no one can pour a cup of tea like the cup you can make. Yours is tea." And she poured out a bitter black brew that was stewing on the hob with a proud flourish. It was the priest's 6th call, and so his 12th cup of tea. His stomach revolted in violent conflict with his charity. He fixed his eyes on the portrait of the late Hogg, a huge enlargement of a small, indistinct snapshot, so vague in the enlargement that it looked like a spirit picture of an ectoplasm. "Accept, O Lord," he said inwardly, "this horrible cup of tea for the holy souls in purgatory, and in particular for Hogg." Offering up his cup of tea. "You will surely be joining us in the novena, Father, the novena for Father Malone's first-class miracle." "I hope you will understand, Magdalena, that the novena is only a private affair. I couldn't allow it at all, were it not that the Holy Church allows us to pray both to saints in heaven and souls in purgatory, so that we are not really presuming anything about where Father Malone is." "I don't know so much about that, Father. Now, Hogg's in purgatory, and you might as well pray to the leg of the table as to him, God rest his soul. Not that he was much good on this earth, come to think of it, but he never could answer a prayer, not even for one of his own orphans. But no sooner did I ask Father Malone to create a new heart in young Clem, than the lad changed so much for the better that I thought he was sickening for something, and I got that worried about him that I had to ask Father Malone to make him himself again." "And did he?" "He did indeed, and a nice trouble he has been to me ever since. And you know, Father, Mrs. Murphy thought her son was lost at sea, and hardly was the prayer to Father Malone out of her mouth when he came round the corner whistling with a parrot in a cage as a present for her. And then there is old Mrs. Greenthorne in the workhouse. She didn't ask for anything, for she is too old to enjoy anything if she got it. And although she left her dead and gone long ago, she has outlived her children, every one of them. But she just told Father Malone it is mighty lonely sitting on a bench in a row of other old women, waiting for death to come, and ever since, she says, he comes to visit her, and he is sitting there beside her. comforting her and telling her it's just the easiest thing in the world to die when your time comes, and as sweet as the morning of First Communion. The thing is, people are really like this. This is so funny. And so it went on. As he went from house to house, everyone had a story of blessedness to tell. The more he heard of them all, the more did Father O'Grady caution and warn as he conceived it his duty to do. But the more he did, but the more, too, did his own heart glow within him. It was as if, when Father Malone went to heaven, he forgot to shut the door behind him, or perhaps deliberately did not shut it, so that now between heaven and Riverside a door stood wide open, letting the light of glory stream through it, showing a patch of the celestial blue to whoever chose to lift his eyes and look. For 50 years on earth, Father Malone had worked to open that door, and now at last he had done it by going through it. Okay, well, we'll do another chapter. Chapter 5. A Son is Born. Their angels in heaven always see the face of my Father. Matthew, chapter 18, verse 10. The last call of the afternoon was to the Jewels. It was after 5 when Father O'Grady reached them, and Art Jewell was home from work, sitting on the steps with Willie in his arms and Martha beside him. They were sitting very still, and for a moment they reminded the priest of a Christmas card that he had received that year, a woodcut by a contemporary artist, showing the Holy Family in modern clothes. Father O'Grady had been very suspicious of it, as indeed he was of all contemporary art. But now he reflected that perhaps after all it was not so absurd as he had thought at the time, since undoubtedly the Jewels were like it. Art was a great big man, with broad shoulders and muscles like thongs of leather. His hair was dark and thick, and fell over his forehead in broad locks. His skin hard and brown. He had a strong flavor of the gypsy about him. And many people said that there was gypsy blood somewhere in the Jewell family. But the same thing could have been said about Martha, if looks were an indication. She, too, was dark and large and handsome. Her face, carved out in magnificent planes, might have grown hard, had not Willie compelled her by his helplessness to be forever the mother of a little baby. All her life, Martha had been a fighter. First of all, she had had to fight for her own survival, and then during the early years of her married life, for Art's. He was then a man without roots. He could hold no job, he could keep no home. With a wife so much stronger than himself, his sense of responsibility was undeveloped. There was no objective in his life strong enough to drive his will. He was like a beautiful ship lying idly in harbor, its crowding sails empty with no wind to fill them and to lift the ship and carry her out to sea. He was sympathetic to a fault, and being very lazy, and a good listener, he was loved to his undoing. He would sit in the doorways for hours, listening to old women's complaints, or on the docks, happy as a cat in the sunlight, listening to the yarns of sailors from foreign parts. Everyone with a trouble to lament or a story to tell could rely upon Art to be at hand to listen. It was only when it came to settling down to a trade that he became elusive. Indeed, he never learnt a trade. He put his people put him as apprentice. His people put him as apprentice to one after another, but when he found out the huge demand a man must answer if he is to acquire a skill, art was missing. Later, when, one after another, he had forsaken every possible trade, he took himself to the docks, simply as a laborer, loading and unloading freight. He managed to be dismissed by one company after another. Everyone wanted to employ him, for he was immensely strong and immensely popular, but no one could employ him because when he was the most wanted, he was not there. Martha married him with her eyes wide open to his faults, and their life became one of wandering from poor room to poor room. No sooner did they settle in one, No sooner did they settle in one than Art defaulted with the rent. He was always open about it, and often enough adoring landladies asked them to stay on another week and see if the tide turned. But Martha knew how swiftly the tides ran on to yet more bitter poverty when Art was in his idle moods, and they moved on. Any other woman but Martha would have left him, or, to save her own humiliation, have gone to work and kept them both. And Art would either have become one of those who drift from doss house to doss house alone, or, what is worse, an abject, hen-pecked husband, for before Willie was born, Martha's nerves were beginning to wear thin, and the very persistency of her character might have made her a nagger. But Martha loved Art, and she loved him more than herself, more, which is much indeed for a woman, than her own vanity. Every time he lost a job, she urged him to go out after another. When they were without a meal to eat and without a penny in their pockets, she would not borrow or let him borrow. She went hungry and made him go hungry. When they could not pay the rent, she pawned their clothes, if they had any that would pawn. If it was winter and she had to pawn their coats, she pawned them and they went cold. And Martha prayed. She made Art pray, and she prayed herself. She prayed literally without ceasing. She was like the man in the parable who woke his neighbor in the night to ask for bread, and would not cease clamoring until he had it. She prayed for their necessities of body and heart and mind and soul. She prayed bravely and regally with a dauntless faith, reminding God that he promises to give not merely a pittance, a crust, and a drab coat, but whatever he, the maker and searcher and lover of the heart, knows to be the real need of every individual, whether it be a cottage or a castle, or a whitewashed cell, whether it be wealth or poverty, pleasure or pain, a crown of gold or a crown of thorns, whether it be the habit of a monk or a garment iridescent as the lilies of the field. She prayed the prayer of importunity. She prayed the prayer of desperation and exasperation. She prayed the prayer of obsession, never knowing how it could possibly be answered. And when the answer came, she did not at first recognize it. Who would have? For the answer was a little child, born when she was past 30, when Art was out of work, and born with a rare and obscure disease of the bones, which made him a helpless and incurable cripple. The effect on Art was a miracle, and it happened with the suddenness of a miracle in the hospital on the night of Willie's birth. For the first time in his life, he realized himself to be a man. It amazed him that he had brought life into the world. He who had never achieved anything, whose psychological discouragement had been so complete that he had accepted himself as a poor thing, unworthy of Martha, unworthy of the air that he breathed. He had brought life into the world. Suddenly he realized that an immense reverence for life had always been dormant in him. That is why he had sometimes stood gazing like a girl at barrows of flowers, why he had nursed lost kittens under his coat and taken them home to Martha on cold nights, why the flight of a bird made him catch his breath, and why he had stood sometimes for half an hour at a time just looking at the first pricking of green on the stunted black tree in the children's play park. To others, the most apparent thing about Willie Jewell was his weakness. He had no power in his back or limbs. As he grew, he had to be propped up to sit. He never learned to talk coherently, and he had tragic little helpless hands. Art saw in him the astonishing power, the tenacity of life itself. He was born at what is perhaps the most depressing hour for onlookers in any hospital, 6:30 on a winter evening, a time when the perpetually hungry nurses were all thinking with emotion of the beetroot and cold sausages for supper, and the sweet sickly cocoa after it. The white, excuse me, the white shiny walls, the faint smell of anesthetic, the hard uniform light of the electric lighting, all took away from any feeling of romance in this stupendous thing, a new life coming into the world. Art was aware of his complete unimportance when, as a father, he was told to sit on a bench in a passage and wait. The nurses passing up and down, thinking of cold sausages, beetroot, and cocoa, did not even glance at him, excepting one who several times brought him a different form to fill out. He had no idea what was on these forms, and he was too nervous to read them, but he put whatever the nurse told him to and signed them. On some of these visits the nurse said, "We won't be long now, Mr. Jewell," as if she was talking to herself, and Art was surprised that she knew his name. Then suddenly, he became the center of attention and tragically important. The nurse hurried towards him, and he stood up, feeling sure it was over, that he was a father, though he had felt none of the things which other fathers had warned him about. Some had declared that they themselves suffered the pains of childhood, or at the very least a mystical toothache. All went through agonies of suspense, but so far Art had only felt foolish. He held out his hand expecting a form. Surely he would have to fill in a form saying that a child had been born to him. But no. To his amazement, the nurse took his outstretched hand and led him to a room where Dr. Moncrief was awaiting him. Oh, boy. "Good evening, Mr. Jewell," he said. "I have very bad news for you." "It's dead," said Art dully. "No, but we have to choose between saving the child's life or your wife's. Your wife is very exhausted, but she wishes to see you before you give your decision. Will you come at once, please?" Martha did not look exhausted and dying in Art's eyes. Her cheeks were deep pink, like rambler roses, and her eyes burned. She seized Art's hand, and he noticed that hers was very hot, with the texture of a withered leaf, and felt quite unfamiliar. Just outside the door, Art had said, "Does she know I've got to choose? I mean, have you told her?" "No, she told me. She knew." He heard Martha's voice, as unfamiliar as the touch of her hand, like the voice of a stranger. "Choose the child, Art. You've got to. The church says so." The whole thing seemed quite unreal. Art turned to the doctor. "The child," he said, and he felt as if he was being strangled. His whole being was crying out, "Martha!" The nurse and the doctor glanced at one another. In their view, they had been told to murder a woman. They did not mind that so very much, but they felt utter contempt for the weak thing who had given the order. "That's religion for you," Dr. Moncrief whispered to the nurse. Then he looked up and saw Martha Jewell's burning eyes fixed on him. Afterwards, he never forgot those eyes, like black stars that scorched his soul. He fought for that infant, and he fought for the woman with that terrible flame in her eyes, and she fought for herself. Art, too, was fighting at last. Martha lived. When at last Willie was born, Dr. Moncrief hoped that he would die and hinted that it would be a mercy. This was not within Art's hearing, but nevertheless there was a terrible moment in which he thought that there was an unspoken agreement between them to let his child die. People had told him of such things, stories that they had got from nurses, of malformed infants left exposed to cold that they might not live. They had put Art's misshapen infant into his own hands to hold, and he felt sure that they would not have done that if they meant him to live. It was only for a moment, however, and then the nurse took him. That was a black, agonized moment for Art Jewell. In it, something fierce and primitive awoke in him, which afterwards never died. He desired his son's life as a thirsting man desires water. And that son's life was a tiny atom, a spark, against which the whole force of what we call civilization conspired. The whole force of it, past, present, and future. Out of the past, a towering mass of evil cast long shadows across him. The greed, the selfishness, the cruelty, the lust, the infidelities of generations of human beings. The multitudinous procession of murder and innocence cast its fire and shadow on the wizened little face, as on the face of all children born into our world. First of all, as if they swept past the Christ child sleeping in the stone manger, the flock of holy innocents, with jubilant cries like wild birds migrating, wild birds winging to the sun of the eternal light, the first martyrs, baptized only with the baptism of blood, with crimson stars tangled in their burning hair. After them, all through the ages, came the martyrs whose death and resurrection seemed the inevitable coincidence of Christ's birth, of the birth of life into the valley of the shadow of death. And always dark on the burning brilliance of martyrdom, the shadow of murder, of the sevenfold evil that is death in men's heart, fighting against life. The shadow of Herod's swung sword, the shadow of Tyburn tree, of man's hand black over the golden pyx in the act of sacrilege, desecrating the body of Christ, violating the sanctuary of his own ancient faith. Shadow of man's hand first striking down the Virgin Mother of God with her child of snow upon her heart. Shadow of factories growing higher than cathedrals, of tall chimneys encircling towns that fall into slums. Shadow of cities growing larger and larger and obliterating the cottages that once were homes. Shadow of machines stretching up nearly to the stars, nearly to the Star of Bethlehem. And where before in this procession there had been the holy innocents flashing through the arch of Herod's swords, there was now a multitude of wizened, twisted children with no gateway even of swords to go through, moving slowly, mechanically, blindly through a bewildering labyrinth of shadows of machines, like a shot in a modern film of Frankenstein horror. From the beautiful swift bodies of the first little martyrs in their swallow flight to the sun, the bodies of children had changed to bowed, grotesque gnomes. Death had ceased to be swift and clean like a flash of silver, as murder itself had ceased to be open and instantaneous. Evil, but an evil of crimson and steel. Now it had become something so furtive that it hid not only from its victims, but from itself, covering its face with a mask of benignity, its stench with cheap scent, so that at length it could look into the mirror unabashed, whether it looked into the mirror of the heavy overmantel of an Edwardian drawing room and saw itself masked in the expensive mask of complacency, or whether it stared back from the dingy mirrors of tawdry seaside hotels and saw itself in the mask of cheap vanity that has frittered away the power to love by lust. Man, she really lays in for these descriptions of our need for redemption. Shadows of swords and fists, of chimneys and machines, shadow of fear, of murder grown timid, grown sentimental and righteous, disguised and hidden, until at last evil is seen only as a projected thing, projected on the bodies of the innocents to cry to heaven for vengeance, as the death wounds of the firstborn of Bethlehem cried out in scarlet. And all the time against this weight of death, life fought and prevailed from generation to generation, because love is stronger than death, and love and life are the seal and sign of God in man. And the battle was fought all through the centuries by those who dared to love, by the boys and girls who faced the immense ardors and endurances of purity, who wrestled with their own flesh and blood and would not fritter away the capacity for passion, who dared to suffer the withering thirst of heart and mind, body and soul, that they might ultimately drink the water of life from the source, who defied misery, oppression, and tyranny, whom the machines could not crush and the wheels could not grind, who were not overcome by poverty, by hunger and cold, who were not afraid of hard work, who were not abject before the herd, who in the multitude remained themselves, two who could carry the world's burden and stand upright and say, I love, who in the midst of death gave life from generation to generation in a kiss. There is a likeness, even in outward things, between the unconquerable life in broken humanity and that in Christ's body. For sin tried to batter life out of the innocent Son of God, just as it tries to batter it out of the world, taking that perfection, that flawless beauty, and scourging it and driving it with thorns and spears, bruising it, overloading it, bending it double under the load, pushing it down in the dust and spitting on it and crucifying it, just as it has done to the bodies of innocents ever since, pitting itself against love, against the likeness of God in the heart of man, crying out against the primal instincts that waken like dawn, even in a twisted humanity, that life must be extinguished in the forms that evil has forced upon it, because man must not be asked to look upon what he has done. Yet it is in the poorest, the weakest, the frailest, that life triumphs. For when sin had disfigured even the immaculate body of Christ beyond recognition, so that it was said even of him, he has no comeliness where he shall be known. It was in that same body, no other, that he rose. In that same body, with those same wounds, that the risen life began. Neither the procession of evil and love through the centuries, nor the awareness of that shining body of ultimate suffering and ultimate love rising again and again from the tomb of the human heart came in words or pictures or in any conscious thought to Art Jewell. But obscurely they were there, and they welled up in immense love for this little deformed creature whom the doctor thought better dead, and in wonder at the power of life that could fight against the whole world and all its evil, and prevail in such weakness, such defenselessness, and such helplessness as this. Prevail it did. Art watched the first physical struggle for survival in that tiny creature. He saw it twitch and try in vain to thrust with its powerless clenched fists. He saw it wrestling visibly for a breath, a heartbeat, a world, a life, an immortal destiny, an eternal heaven, the vision of God, and it won. Art Jewell knew that it was his own life that won. The child suffered. A new experience came to Art, an experience that grew in him all through the years of Willie's life. He saw his own eyes looking at him from the face of his dumb child, not with reproach for his life, but with love. He saw in those eyes the terrifying joy of innocence crucified. And Art Jewell, being made in the image and likeness of God, learnt something of the secret of the Eternal Father when his only Son looked at him from the cross. The miracle which took place on the night of Willie's birthday was lasting. Art went to work, loading and unloading freight from ships. He was not trained for anything else, and his broad back and strong arms fitted him for that. He was there regularly, early in the morning, and often enough working overtime in the evening. At first the employers were skeptical. Then they learned to trust him, and finally to rely on him. There are two kinds of poverty, the holy and the unholy. The unholy is like damp rot. It is the poverty that men should not accept. It is forced upon them by evil and injustice. Everything that it touches rots and decays. It is verminous and dirty. It breeds bitterness, fear, and hatred. It is the misery generated into the world by the union of fear and greed. The other, holy poverty, is different. It is the poverty that flowers in frugality. It teaches men the glory of working for those whom they love and lifts their minds to contemplation. They discover in it God's fatherhood. This poverty does not ask for rest. It possesses peace. It is content with necessity. It has the vision which enables the heart to discern between the essential and the unessential. It has the humility which makes it invulnerable, the freedom which goes with having nothing, the gratitude that goes with having everything. It is poverty made lovely because Christ has taken it to his immaculate heart. For 7 years the Jewells had kept a home, and it was blessed with this holy poverty. Art had to work hard for money. Sometimes, even now, he had to struggle with himself to go on working hard and regularly for it. But he won, for money was no longer connected in his mind only with torturing anxiety and sordid scenes. It was food and drink and warmth and sleep for their little son. Their one room became beautiful. Willie loved bright colors and tinkling sounds. Art painted what furniture they had, a lot of it made out of packing cases. He rubbed these pieces down, smoothed them, and painted them blue. He framed some bright prints out of books and hung them on the walls. Martha made curtains of flowered cotton and a patchwork quilt for the bed, and on Willie's first birthday, they bought him a glass chime that hung in the window and tinkled whenever a breeze came up from the river. Wow. That's the end of that chapter. Okay, so we have the stage is set. Gotten to know the baby that finally is he's the miracle around which the story is told. I'm going to be reading another couple of chapters next week. I hope you'll enjoy it then. Thank you and goodbye.